In my quest to deliver weird and wonderful Xenoblade challenges, today I ask the question of what Xenoblade game has the lowest amount of button presses. Or something like that, the title's still a work in progress. I decided I'd be playing each installment on New Game Plus, as my main goal was to find the lowest number possible. And not because I didn't want to play 3 50-hour JRPGs back to back. Of course, you could split this challenge into categories, like a speedrun, but for the purpose of this video, I didn't think it was necessary. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the tiny details of each run, so starting with Xenoblade 1, the main thing to take away is that all the voice dialogue auto-advances, saving a ton of presses, which unsurprisingly meant the majority of Xenoblade 1's button presses came from interacting with things, whether that was the Hyentia in Chapter 8 or fights during Chapter 14. Speaking of fights, like any good speedrun, I theorised that there may have been times where I would have been able to optimise. One of the most obvious examples was during the Telethia fight in Chapter 7, as I had to use Monado Purge, so if there was a way to avoid this, then I could have easily saved 15 presses. Regardless though, after adding up all the numbers, Xenoblade 1's final count stood at a whopping 407. Now my prediction going into this was that Xenoblade 3 would have the lowest amount of presses, due to it having the least amount of chapters, but as Xenoblade 2 would prove, having less chapters doesn't always mean a lower count. But just before I move on from Xenoblade 1, please tell me I'm not the only one who didn't know you could just walk past the fights in memory space. Or is that a New Game Plus thing? Also, if anyone's wondering why I'm controlling Melia, it's because she becomes the party leader at the start of Chapter 17 and doesn't get swapped out when Shulk rejoins. But now, on to Xenoblade 2. So unlike Xenoblade 1, Xenoblade 2 has a lot more text, and because none of it auto-advances, you have to waste 2 presses skipping it wherever possible. This was at its worst during Chapters 4 and 6, as talking to all the NPCs really racked up the presses. On top of that, you have to initiate almost all the story battles, and unlike Xenoblade 1's linearity and 3's connected world, you have to use a bunch of button presses to skip travel between the titans. That is unless it's possible to move between them without skip travelling, in which case, I did not know that. The only saving grace is that through New Game Plus, you can save quite a few button presses in the early game by already having the Bion connectors and puzzle tree wood. But with all that said, Xenoblade 2's final press counter came out to an eye-watering 909 presses. Now here's a fun fact for all my fellow Mythra fans. When choosing a name in Chapter 8, the default option is set to Mythra. So if you want the lowest amount of presses, then you've got no other option. But with that said, we finally come to Xenoblade 3. Now there isn't much to say about Xenoblade 3 that doesn't overlap with what I've said about 1 or 2. Interestingly, there are a lot of little tricks I could do to save presses. For example, in Keva's castle, I could draw the enemies aggro until one of them used a lock-on art, which saved me having to initiate the fight, and another example was instead of having to jump into the water to leave the relay base, instead I got the enemies to defeat Tyon, warping the party back outside. But what was annoying though, was walking up to the Bravery and realising I wouldn't be able to use it, meaning I had to swim all the way around Erythia Sea. That was until the game just decides to put you in it anyway, so I caved and just didn't count the presses. Which means, after 7 chapters, Xenoblade 3's final press count stands at an incredibly close 419, meaning my prediction was wrong and Xenoblade 1 has the lowest count. Is what I'd like to say, but while editing this video, it occurred to me that it was strange for Xenoblade 1's voice text to auto-advance and Xenoblade 3's to not. So I checked in the game options, and to my utter horror,
suck on this!
This was a soul-crushing revelation, as this would mean Xenoblade 3's final number would actually be significantly lower, maybe even halved. So what I'm going to do is replay the entire game again to get a more accurate number and add it in post. But before that, if you like what I'm doing here, subscribe, and now here's the answer. The final total is 294. Thanks for watching.